The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was attacking. It came sideways, sharp and merciless, like the sky itself had decided that tonight was the night it would finish what the cold had started. The wind screamed through the pine trees in long, hollow wails, the kind of sound that doesn't just reach your ears, it reaches something deeper, something older. The part of you that remembers, even without being told, that nature does not care about survival, that the wilderness has never once made a promise to be kind. Caddy ran anyway. Her boots punched through the frozen crust of snow with every step, thigh deep in places, her legs burning from the effort, her lungs pulling in air so cold it felt like swallowing broken glass. She didn't look back. She hadn't looked back in 20 minutes, and she wasn't going to start now. But because looking back meant acknowledging what was behind her, and if she acknowledged it, the fear would catch up to the rest of her body, and then she would stop. And if she stopped, she would die. Not metaphorically, not dramatically. Actually, genuinely, die. The tree line ahead was dense. Ancient pines packed so tightly together, their branches interlocked like the fingers of sleeping giants, the kind of forest that didn't welcome visitors, the kind that swallowed light whole, that muffled sound and distance and direction until you weren't sure anymore which way was forward and which way was down. But Caddy aimed straight for it, because the open field behind her offered nothing. No cover, no shadow, no mercy. She had a 12-minute head start, maybe less. She'd counted it out as she ran, the rough distance between the eastern ridge of Ashvale territory and the moment she'd heard the first howl split the night sky. 3 howls total, short, clipped, deliberate. Not the howl of wolves lost in the dark. Those were signal howls, organized, coordinated. The kind a trained pack used to communicate across distance when they were herding something in. Herding her in. Her left side throbbed. A deep, pulsing ache just beneath her ribs, where she'd caught the edge of a branch at full sprint 20 minutes ago, the wood splitting her jacket and drawing a line of blood that had since soaked through 2 layers of clothing and was now threatening to freeze against her skin. She pressed her hand against it instinctively as she ran, kept moving. Don't stop, don't think, just move. And that was the only rule when everything else collapsed. She'd learned it young, younger than any person should have to learn anything that harsh. Keep your feet moving and your eyes forward, and trust that the ground will hold you one step longer than the fear says it will. She burst through the tree line. The forest swallowed her instantly, the wind dropping to almost nothing inside the dense canopy, the howling muffled to a distant, muted moan somewhere above. The darkness here was a different kind. Not the flat, open darkness of the snowfield, but a layered thing, full of shapes and shadows that moved at the edge of vision and may or may not have been real. Caddy didn't slow down. She wove between the trunks, her right hand grazing bark to keep herself oriented, her breath coming out in ragged white clouds that dissolved into the black. But she didn't belong to any pack anymore. That was the truth of it. The truth she carried like a stone in her chest every single day. She had no territory, no alpha's protection, no pack bond to call on, no shared warmth, no place in the hierarchy that would make another wolf think twice before running her down. She was unmapped, unclassified. And in the werewolf world, unmapped meant unprotected, and unprotected meant fair game for anyone with the strength and the arrogance to decide they wanted something from you. And right now, someone did. She didn't know which pack had sent the hunters. She hadn't stopped long enough to get a clear scent before the first signal howl had split the night open. Could be the Grafen pack. They ran these northern territories and didn't take kindly to lone wolves crossing their land without permission. As could be mercenaries, the kind that operated in the gaps between formal pack law, hired by someone who wanted her found, and brought back quietly. Could be something worse. She tried not to think about the worse options. The ground shifted beneath her boot and she lurched, her ankle twisting on a hidden root buried under the snow, and she went down, hard, one knee slamming into the frozen earth while her hands shot out and caught a tree trunk before her face connected with the ground. She gasped, more from shock than pain, and hung there for a moment, gripping the bark, her whole body trembling. Get up! Get up right now. She obeyed herself, pushed back to her feet, tested the ankle. It screamed but held, and kept moving at a slightly slower pace, jaw tight against the pain. That's when she felt it, as something shifted in the space between one breath and the next. A change in the air, not the wind, not the cold, not any external thing she could point to and name. It was internal. It was hers. A low, soundless vibration that started somewhere in the center of her chest and radiated outward through her ribs, into her arms, down into her fingertips. She'd felt it before. 3 times, to be exact. And each time it had come with a warning attached. The kind her body offered her before her conscious mind caught up. Something nearby was in trouble. Not the hunters behind her. Something else. Something ahead. She almost ignored it. Almost talked herself past it the way she'd learned to talk herself past most things that pulled at her from the inside. The instincts that flared up at inconvenient moments. At the feelings that rose without invitation and made decisions for her before she'd agreed to anything. She was already injured, already being tracked. The smart, rational, survivalist part of her brain was screaming at her to keep moving, to put as much ground between herself and those signal howls as possible. But the vibration in her chest pulled toward something, not away from it. And she slowed. And then she heard it. Barely audible beneath the groan of wind in the canopy above. A sound so low and so broken, it took her a full 3 seconds to identify it as breathing. Labored. Wet. The specific rhythm of something that was trying to stay alive through sheer determination and losing the argument. She turned left. Moved through a gap between 2 massive pines, ducking under a low branch, and there, in a small, a sheltered hollow where the roots of a fallen birch tree had created a natural cradle in the earth, she found the wolf. He was enormous, even collapsed and barely conscious, curled on his side in a way that spoke of profound exhaustion rather than chosen rest. He was the largest wolf she had ever seen in her life. His fur was the deep, dark gray of thunderclouds, almost black at the spine, lightening to silver along the flanks and jaw. He was bleeding from his left shoulder, a wound so deep the snow beneath him had turned a vivid, terrible red that steamed faintly in the freezing air. His eyes were half open, glazed with the particular flat quality she recognized as shock, and his breathing, that labored, wet sound she'd heard, was the sound of a body arguing with its own shutdown. He wasn't going to last the night. Big Caddy stood at the edge of that hollow for 3 full seconds, the wind pressing against her back like a hand urging her forward. She could feel the hunters somewhere behind her. Closer now, maybe, the signal howls silent in a way that was almost more frightening than sound. She had no supplies to speak of, no pack, no plan. A wound in her own side that was going to cause her real problems if she didn't get somewhere warm in the next few hours. Every intelligent thought she had told her to keep running. And then the wolf's eyes found hers. They were amber, even glazed, even fading, even barely holding on to consciousness, and something in them was so deeply, unutterably aware that it stopped the air in her lungs. He looked at her the way no animal looked at a stranger, But he looked at her the way you look at someone you recognize from a dream you've never been able to describe out loud. "Okay," she whispered, to herself, to the wolf, to the frozen night, to whatever combination of chance and instinct had just ended her clean escape. "Okay." She moved into the hollow and knelt beside him in the blood-red snow. "Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling you in, if you can already feel that cold pressing against your skin and that weight in her chest, then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to Luna's Alpha Tales right now if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below telling me, what would you have done? Would you have kept running? Or would those amber eyes have stopped you too? Let's go. Odd, because this is only the beginning. She worked fast, not because she was calm. She was the opposite of calm. Her hands were shaking. Her side was bleeding steadily through the pressure she kept forgetting to maintain. And somewhere behind her in the dark forest, 3 trained hunters were moving through the trees with the kind of practiced silence that meant they'd done this before and hadn't failed yet. She was acutely, viscerally aware of every second ticking past her, like coins dropping into a well she couldn't afford to empty. But she worked fast because the wolf needed her to. She stripped off her outer jacket without thinking about what that would cost her in warmth. The cold hit her immediately, brutal and immediate through just her thermal layer, raising goosebumps across every inch of exposed skin. She folded the jacket into a rough compress and pressed it firm against the wound on the wolf's shoulder. He flinched. A low, broken sound came from somewhere deep in his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. Something in between. The sound of something powerful trying to remember how to be. "I know," she said quietly. "I know it hurts. Stay with me." She didn't know why she was talking to him. Wolves in their animal form didn't process human language the way humans assumed. It wasn't a translation situation. Wasn't like speaking to a dog and having them understand the words. But tone traveled. Intention traveled. She'd believed that her entire life, through every piece of evidence to the contrary, and she believed it now with the wolf's shallow, a ragged breath warming the skin of her wrist as she held pressure against his wound. His amber eyes tracked her face. Slowly, deliberately. She pulled the lace from her right boot with her teeth, working it free from the eyelets in the dark without looking, and used it to bind the compress in place as best she could, a rough, imperfect field dressing that wouldn't hold long, but might slow the bleeding enough to matter. She moved efficiently, her fingers finding the task with a muscle memory she'd built in the years she'd spent alone. You learn to care for injuries when there was no one else to do it. You learn to be precise and quick and unsentimental, because the alternative was to fall apart, and falling apart didn't suture wounds. The wolf watched her the entire time. It was unsettling, actually, not frightening, unsettling in a different way, a more complicated way. The quality of his attention was too focused for an animal in shock, too deliberate. Even glazed, even fading, his eyes moved with her hands, tracked her face, returned to her eyes each time she glanced at him, like he was cataloging her, like he was making a decision about something she hadn't been asked to weigh in on. She'd just tightened the last knot on the compress when the sound came. Not a howl this time. Footsteps. Crunching snow. Close. Far too close, maybe 40 yards into the trees to the northeast, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that already knew it had found what it was looking for. Cattie's head came up. Every nerve in her body fired simultaneously. She was on her feet before the thought fully formed, pivoting toward the sound, and her right hand dropping to the hunting knife at her hip, a short, practical blade she'd carried for 3 years and used exactly twice, both times against things that hadn't expected her to fight back. Her pulse hammered in her temples. The wound in her side chose this exact moment to remind her of its existence with a white-hot flare of pain that stole 2 full seconds of her focus. 2 seconds she didn't have. The figure stepped out from between the trees. She had her knife up, and her weight shifted to her back foot before she got a clear look at him, and when she did, when the ambient moonlight filtering through the canopy above finally resolved his outline into something specific and real, her hand didn't lower. But her breath did something complicated. He was tall. That was the first thing. Not tall in the way that registered as height and moved on, tall in the way that reorganized the space around him, that made the massive pine trees framing him seem somehow proportional rather than enormous. He wore no jacket, despite temperatures that had already dropped well below freezing. Just a dark thermal shirt across a chest that carried its breadth without effort, dark cargo pants, boots that moved through the snow without the crunching her own steps had made. Like he knew exactly where to place his feet to silence himself. His face was all angles and shadow. Strong jaw sharpened by the cold and the darkness into something almost architectural. Dark hair pushed back from a face that was... And she noted this with the detached precision of someone trying to assess a threat. Startlingly composed. No visible alarm, and no aggression in his posture, just a stillness that was more unnerving than either of those things would have been, because stillness like that didn't come from peace. It came from absolute, practiced control over every impulse running beneath the surface. His eyes, when they found hers, were amber, the exact shade of amber as the wolf bleeding in the hollow behind her. The realization moved through her slowly, like ice water finding every crack and channel in her chest, because it was impossible and obvious, and she didn't want to say it out loud in case saying it made it more real. She didn't say it. She kept her knife up and her chin level, and her voice as steady as she could manufacture it. Don't come closer. He didn't come closer. But he also didn't stop looking at her. That same quality of attention and cataloging and deliberate and somehow deeply, uncomfortably specific. You saved him, he said. His voice was low, not soft. Low in the way that certain sounds are low because they originate somewhere foundational, somewhere load-bearing. It moved through the cold air and settled, and Caddy felt it in her sternum before she processed it in her ears. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that. And more dangerous. The compress. The binding. The field dressing on a wound that would have killed him in another 20 minutes. His eyes dropped briefly to her bootlace knotted against gray fur, then back to her face. You saved him. And you did it while being tracked. She said nothing. You're bleeding, he said. Your left side. Through 2 layers. I'm aware. You chose to stop and help him anyway. She still said nothing. The knife didn't move. He took 1 step closer. Not aggressive, not challenging, just a single step that brought the moonlight across his face at a new angle and showed her something she hadn't seen from a distance. His jaw was tight. Not with anger. With something that looked, if she was being precise about it, like the kind of restraint a person exercised when they were feeling too much and had too much experience with the cost of letting it show. Put the knife down, Caddy. The sound of her name in his mouth stopped the world. Not because he'd said it loudly, he hadn't. Not because there was any threat in it, there wasn't. It stopped the world because she had not told him her name. She hadn't spoken to another living person in 11 days. She had no identification on her, no pack marker, no documentation of any kind. She was a ghost moving through territories that didn't claim her, and she had been very careful about that. Very deliberate, very thorough. He knew her name. How do you know my name? She said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat and cold and shaking slightly at the edges. He held her gaze. Something moved behind his amber eyes, something old and heavy, and layered in ways she didn't have the context to read. "Because," he said, "I've been looking for you for 8 months." The forest pressed in around them, the cold, the dark, the sound of the wounded wolf breathing in the hollow behind her, the distant, silent threat of the hunters somewhere in the trees. And in the center of all of it, Caddy stood with her knife between herself and a man whose eyes matched the wolf she'd pulled from the edge of death, who knew her name without being given it, who had been searching for her through seasons she'd spent running. She didn't lower the knife. But for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't sure running was the right answer. "Who are you?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "My name is, and that wolf behind you is my brother." The cold deepened around them. Somewhere above the canopy, the moon slid behind a cloud, and the light shifted to something softer, something almost mournful. And Caddy stood at the edge of a decision she didn't fully understand yet, with a stranger's name on the air between them and the feeling, that deep, chest-level vibration that had led her here in the first place, humming quietly beneath her ribs like a second heartbeat. Like a warning. Like a welcome. Like both things at once. She didn't lower the knife for another full minute. Evander didn't ask her to again. That was the thing she noticed first. He made the statement, gave her the information, and then simply waited. No pressure, no posturing, no subtle shift in his stance designed to remind her of the difference in their size and strength, the way dominant wolves so often did when they wanted compliance without technically demanding it. He just stood there in the moonlit dark, with his hands loose at his sides, and let her take the time she needed. It was deeply unfamiliar, and because it was unfamiliar, it made her more suspicious, not less. Yet she lowered the knife eventually, not because she trusted him, but because her arm was trembling from cold and blood loss, and she needed to conserve what was left of her strength for things that actually required it. She kept the blade unsheathed, a compromise between sense and instinct that felt about right for the situation. "Your brother," she repeated. "Emric." Evander moved past her, giving her a wide berth, she noticed, deliberate and careful, and crouched beside the hollow where the gray wolf lay. His hands found the makeshift compress with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with the rest of him, checking the binding, pressing lightly at the edges of the wound. The wolf, Emric, made a low sound and shifted his head toward his brother's hand. Something passed between them in that moment. Something wordless and old. The particular language of people who have survived things together. Caddy watched it and felt the familiar hollow ache open up in her chest. She knew what that looked like. She remembered what it felt like. The specific comfort of another person's presence that required no explanation, the warmth of being known, not just recognized. She had not felt it in 3 years. She had trained herself, in those 3 years, to treat the memory of it as something dangerous, a wound you stopped touching so it could scar over properly. "He shifted in the middle of the attack," Evander said without looking up. "He shouldn't have. He was already hurt, and the shift cost him more blood than he could afford." His jaw tightened. "That's Emric. He shifts when he's cornered every time. It's his first response, and I've never been able to break him of it." There was something in his voice when he said it. Exasperation, yes, but threaded through with an affection so deep it had gone past sentiment into something structural. Like the exasperation was built on a foundation of love so established, it didn't need to announce itself. Caddy looked away. "Who attacked him?" she asked. "The same people tracking you." That landed like a stone in still water, the implications spreading outward. She filed it away, pressed her hand harder against her side, and started doing the mental calculations of how much time they had before the hunters closed the remaining distance. She gave it 12 minutes, maybe 10. "We need to move him," she said. "There's a shelter, half a mile northeast. My people are there." He finally looked up at her, and even in the dark, from a crouching position, he managed to carry the particular gravity of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. "You'll come with us." It wasn't phrased as a request, but it wasn't quite an order either. It lived in the uncomfortable territory between the two, and she felt the automatic resistance rise in her the way it always did when someone assumed she would simply follow. "I don't follow alphas," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, closer to recognition. "I know," he said quietly. "You haven't in a long time." She stared at him. He stood, and whatever he read in her face made him choose his next words with visible care. "I'll explain everything, but not here. Not while we're still in range." He looked at her side. At the hand she was pressing against herself, at the dark stain spreading slowly through the gray thermal fabric. "And not while you're bleeding through your third layer." She wanted to argue. She genuinely wanted to find the words to push back, to establish the distance she maintained between herself and every alpha she'd encountered since the night her old pack had stood in a circle around her and collectively decided she was too much of a risk to keep. But the hunters were coming. Emmerich was dying by degrees, and her side hurt in a way that was starting to involve her spine. She put the knife back in its sheath. "Lead," she said flatly, "and stay out of my head." He nodded once. No triumph in it, just acknowledgement. She thought about her old pack while they moved, but she couldn't help it. She never could when the cold got deep enough and the exhaustion stripped away the careful insulation she kept around those memories. They surfaced anyway, not gently, not with the soft quality of nostalgia, but the way old injuries resurface. Sharp, without warning, in the tissue that never quite healed right. The Ashenvale pack had been her home for the first 22 years of her life. She'd been born into it. Her mother, a mid-ranking she-wolf, her father, a tracker who'd died when she was 6 in a territorial dispute she hadn't been old enough to understand. She'd grown up in the communal warmth of a large pack, surrounded by people who knew her name and her face, and the particular way she laughed too loud at things that weren't quite funny enough to justify it. She'd been ordinary in all the ways that mattered. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not positioned anywhere near the alpha bloodline. Just catty. Just a girl who liked the forest at dawn and had a habit of talking to injured animals and could run 4 miles without stopping when the mood took her. And then she'd turned 22, and everything had broken open. It had happened during a full moon run, the monthly ritual where the entire pack shifted together, moving through the territory in a coordinated mass of fur and instinct and shared joy. She'd shifted with them, the way she always had, and something had gone wrong. Or right. She still didn't know which word applied. Her shift had come differently that night. Not the usual process, not the familiar pull and release of her body moving between its two forms. Something else had moved through her, something that started at the base of her spine and traveled upward like a current, white and burning. And when she'd completed the shift, she wasn't standing in her usual gray-brown wolf form. She was silver. Not a silver-tinged coat. She'd seen those before. They were rare, but not unheard of. This was different. She was luminous. She was lit from within, the light moving under her fur like something alive and separate from her. Her paw prints leaving faint silver traces in the grass that faded slowly after she lifted each foot. The pack had stopped around her. She'd felt their shock before she saw their faces. Had felt it as a collective withdrawal, 27 pack bonds pulling slightly back, like 27 people taking one synchronized step away. That the Alpha had looked at her with eyes that held no warmth. "What are you?" he'd said. "Not who. What?" She hadn't had an answer. She didn't have one now, 3 years later, still running. The silver light had never fully gone away after that night. It lived in her hands sometimes, in moments of extreme emotion, a faint luminescence that she'd learned to suppress the way you learn to suppress anything that made people afraid of you. She kept it buried beneath layers of control and exhaustion and deliberate ordinariness. But it was there. It had always been there. Waiting. The pack had given her 3 days to leave. The Alpha had framed it carefully. Not exile, he'd said. Not punishment. A precautionary separation, a temporary measure while they consulted with older wolves, with those who might understand what she was. And he'd used the language of concern and community, while his eyes said something entirely different. She'd left before the 3 days were up. She hadn't let them watch her go. The shelter materialized out of the dark exactly when Evander said it would. A long, low structure built against the natural rock face of a ridge, camouflaged so effectively with pine branches and snow-dusted canvas that she'd walked within 20 feet of it before her eyes resolved it into something intentional. There were wolves here. She felt them before she saw them. The low-frequency awareness of multiple shifters in close proximity, the particular density of presence that a pack carried even indoors. She stopped walking. Evander turned and looked at her. He'd been carrying Emmerich. Shifted to human form now, unconscious and wrapped in a thermal blanket someone had brought out to meet them, with a steadiness that hadn't wavered once across half a mile of rough terrain. He looked at her, stopped in the snow, and didn't say anything immediately. "I don't do well with packs," she said. Flat, honest, a warning, more than a confession. "I know," he said. Again, that particular quality of knowing. Not assumed, not generalized. Specific. "How?" she said. "How do you keep knowing things about me that I haven't told you?" He shifted Emmerich's weight slightly, his amber eyes steady on her face. The shelter door was open behind him, warm light spilling out across the snow in a long golden wedge that reached almost to her feet, but not quite. "Because," he said, and there was something in his voice now, something careful and weighted, so like a man choosing whether to set down something heavy. "You're not the first person to carry that light, Caddy, and every person who's carried it before you has left a record, a history." A pause. "I've spent 8 months reading it." She stood in the cold and the dark at the edge of the warm light and felt the thing in her chest. That vibration, that hum, respond to his words like a key, finding a lock it was made for. She didn't understand it. She didn't trust it. But she took one step forward into the gold and followed him inside. The inside of the shelter was warmer than she expected. Not just in temperature, in texture. In the quality of the air itself, which carried the specific density of a space that had held many bodies and many breaths and many quiet conversations over a long period of time. There were bedrolls along the walls, a fire burning low in a stone pit at the center, lanterns hung at intervals from the ridge beam above. 7 wolves in human form, ranging from a boy who couldn't have been older than 16 to a woman with silver-streaked hair and a face carved by decades of weather and decision. They all looked up when Evander entered. They all looked at Caddy. She met each gaze in turn. Not aggressively, not submissively. Level. The way she'd learned to meet the eyes of strangers in the years since she'd stopped belonging anywhere. It was a careful calibration, that look. Enough presence to signal that she wasn't prey. Enough restraint to signal that she wasn't a threat. The narrow corridor between those two things was where she lived now, and she'd gotten very good at finding it quickly, as most of them looked away first. The silver-haired woman didn't. She watched Caddy with dark eyes that held the particular quality of deep, patient attention. Not scrutiny, not suspicion, but the focused stillness of someone reading something they'd been waiting a very long time to read. Her hands were folded in her lap. She sat slightly apart from the others, cross-legged on a worn blanket near the fire, and she didn't move as Evander laid Emmerich down on the nearest bedroll and began issuing quiet instructions to the others in a voice too low for Caddy to catch from the doorway. Caddy stayed near the entrance. Old habit. Always know where the exit is. Someone pressed a tin cup of something hot into her hands. She startled slightly, looked down, looked up. A young woman with a wide, serious face and dark braids was watching her with careful eyes. "Yarrow tea," the young woman said, "for the blood loss." Caddy looked at the cup for a moment, then drank. It was bitter and earthy and almost unbearably warm going down, and she felt her hands stop shaking by degrees as she finished it. "Thank you," she said. The young woman, girl, really, maybe 19, nodded once and moved away, but not before casting one quick, sidelong glance back at Caddy's hands, at the fingers wrapped around the tin cup. Looking, Caddy realized with a cold, quiet understanding for the light. They dressed her wound in relative silence. The silver-haired woman did it. She'd crossed the shelter floor without announcing her intention. He simply arrived at Caddy's side with a medical kit, and a manner so matter-of-fact that refusing would have required more energy than complying. She worked with the efficiency of long practice, cleaning the gash along Caddy's ribs, assessing its depth with two careful fingers that pressed without hesitation and withdrew without drama. "Through and through," she said. "No organ involvement. You'll need stitches." "Do them," Caddy said. The woman looked at her, a brief, appraising look, and did them. Caddy sat straight through all 11, jaw tight, breathing through her nose, watching Evander across the shelter while he sat with Emmerich and waited for his brother's breathing to stabilize. He didn't look up during the stitching. But something in the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of tension there, suggested he was more aware of what was happening behind him than his posture admitted. "I'm Marin," the silver-haired woman said, tying the last knot with the precision of someone who'd done this in far worse conditions. "I've been with Evander's pack for 30 years. I was with his father before that." Caddy said nothing, which Marin appeared to treat as an invitation to continue. "We've been tracking the Silver Flame sightings for the past 8 months, Marin said, her voice conversational, unhurried. "There have been 4, all in the Northern Territories, all following the old moon path." She smoothed a bandage over the closed wound with a firm, careful hand. "The last confirmed sighting was 11 days ago, near the Grayville Crossing." 11 days ago. The night Caddy had crossed into the Northern Territories. The night she'd felt the light surge up through her hands unexpectedly in the dark, triggered by something she'd heard in the trees. A sound that had turned out to be nothing, just the wind. But her body had responded before her mind could intervene. She'd thought no one had seen. "You left traces," Marin said, reading her expression with the ease of someone who'd had a very long time to practice reading people. "In the snow, the prints." She paused. "It's how Emmerich found you before we did." He went ahead without permission, as he tends to do. Caddy absorbed this, filed it alongside everything else she'd filed tonight, the growing stack of information she didn't yet have enough context to properly interpret. What is the Silver Flame?" she asked. She kept her voice flat, clinical, like she was asking about a phenomenon that had nothing to do with her. Marin looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Come with me." The cave entrance was behind the shelter. She hadn't seen it from outside. It was recessed into the rock face, concealed behind a natural overhang that cast permanent shadow regardless of the light. Marin led her through it with a lantern held low, and Caddy followed because the curiosity in her chest had overridden the caution, which was something she noted and didn't fully approve of, but couldn't seem to stop. The tunnel was short, 10 feet, maybe 12, and opened into a chamber roughly the size of a large room, with a ceiling that arched high enough above them that the lantern light didn't reach it. And the floor was smooth stone, and at the center of it, cut directly into the rock in lines so precise they could not have been made by anything natural, was a circle. Inside the circle, symbols, dozens of them, radiating outward from a central point like the spokes of a wheel, each one distinct, each one worn smooth at the edges by what looked like centuries of contact. Some she didn't recognize, but some she did. Not from study, not from any pack lore she'd been formally taught. From somewhere older than that. From the deep place behind her sternum where the vibration lived. The place she'd never been able to put language to. Her feet stopped moving of their own accord. The lantern light shifted as Marin moved to the wall and touched something, and Caddy realized the symbols extended beyond the circle. They covered the walls entirely, whole floor to ceiling, layered and overlapping in a density that made her eyes move and move without landing, like trying to read a conversation being spoken by 100 voices simultaneously. "This is a Lunara shrine," Marin said. Her voice had changed in here, quieter, careful, the way voices got in places that had earned a particular kind of respect. "There are 7 in the known world. 3 have been destroyed. This is the oldest of the remaining 4. Caddy's eyes moved across the walls, moved and snagged on something. A symbol repeated more than the others, positioned at the cardinal points of the circle and at intervals along the walls, with a frequency that felt intentional, felt like emphasis. A flame inside a crescent moon. Her mouth went dry. She had that symbol on her body. Et had had it since birth. Her mother had called it a birthmark, a patch of skin along her left collarbone, where the pigmentation was slightly lighter than the rest, shaped in a way that had always been vague enough to dismiss. She'd dismissed it, consciously, deliberately, in the same way she'd dismissed everything about herself that didn't fit into the category of ordinary. Her hand moved to her collarbone without deciding to. "The mark of the Lunara flame," Marin said, watching her. "It appears in the historical record 9 times across 4 centuries, always on a female wolf, always in a time of significant fracture, when pack law is failing, when the old territories are destabilized, when the balance between wolf and human world is tipping towards something irreversible." "That's not me," Caddy said, but her voice came out smaller than she intended. "The shrine lit up 11 days ago," Marin said simply. "When you crossed the gray veil, the symbols on the north wall activated. We have people stationed here who maintain a watch rotation. They sent word immediately." She paused. "The last time that happened was 112 years ago." The chamber was very quiet. Caddy could hear her own heartbeat. "The texts call her different things in different centuries," Marin continued, moving slowly around the edge of the circle, the lantern casting her shadow long and shifting across the inscribed walls. "Child of the flame, the silver warden, the one who carries the moon's grief." She stopped, looked directly at Caddy. "She is described as someone born outside the hierarchy, someone rejected by the structures she was meant to protect, someone who carries a power she cannot yet control and has spent years trying to outrun." The silence afterward was absolute. Caddy stood at the edge of the circle and felt the vibration in her chest shift, change quality, deepen, as if something beneath her had recognized the chamber and was responding to it the way a tuning fork responds to its frequency. The light in her hands began, faintly and without her permission, to rise. She pressed them flat against her thighs, pushed it back down. "I'm not a prophecy," she said. The words felt thin, unconvincing even to herself. "No, said Evander. She turned. He was standing at the tunnel entrance, filling it, his amber eyes moving from the softly glowing symbols on the walls to her face. She didn't know how long he'd been there. She didn't know how she'd missed him entering, except that the chamber had been pulling too hard at her attention to leave room for anything else. "You're not a prophecy," he said, quietly, without the detached authority she'd expected. "You're a person, who happens to be the fulfillment of one." He moved into the chamber, slowly giving her the space to react, and stopped at the edge of the circle. His eyes found the flame inside crescent symbol on the north wall and stayed there. "There's a difference. The prophecy is a map. You're the one who has to walk it." He looked back at her, "Whether you want to or not." The light in her hands surged briefly, unbidden, a flash of silver that lit the chamber walls and made every inscribed symbol flare simultaneously, a ripple of illumination that traveled outward from her like a stone dropped in still water. Then it died back down. Cady stood in the aftermath of it, breathing, with the weight of something she had no word large enough for settling across her shoulders. She looked at the flame inside the crescent moon on the wall, at its twin on her collarbone, hidden beneath her shirt, at the circle of symbols in the stone floor that had been waiting, patiently and without complaint, for 112 years. "What does it want from me?" she asked. And she didn't entirely mean the prophecy. Evander was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and very careful, the way you spoke to something you didn't want to startle. "It doesn't want anything from you," he said. "It wants to give you something back." A pause. Something that was taken. The lantern flame guttered, the symbols breathed. And deep inside Cady's chest, yet in the place where the vibration lived, something that had been curled tight and silent for 3 years shifted, cautiously, almost imperceptibly, toward the light. She slept for 4 hours. Not because she felt safe. She hadn't felt safe in 3 years and wasn't naive enough to mistake exhaustion for security, but her body made the decision without consulting her, pulling her under somewhere between sitting down on a bedroll near the fire and intending to think through everything Marin had told her. One moment she was staring at the low flames, cataloging exits and assessing the pack members arranged around the shelter, with the automatic precision of someone long accustomed to sleeping in hostile territory. The next, she was gone. She dreamed of the silver light, and not as something frightening, not the way she usually experienced it in the rare moments she allowed herself to dream about it at all. In this dream, it was simply present, filling her hands, running up her arms, moving through her the way blood moved. Natural, unremarkable, like breathing, like something that had always been hers and had simply been waiting for her to stop apologizing for it. She woke to the sound of voices, raised voices, the specific frequency of an argument that had already moved past the stage of reasonable disagreement and was heading somewhere with sharper edges. She was upright before she'd fully processed the transition from sleep, her hand on her knife, her eyes scanning the shelter with the rapid, as sufficient assessment of someone whose instincts had been sharpened by years of waking up in places that might require immediate action. The shelter was brighter. Dawn had come while she slept. Pale gray light pressing through the gaps in the canvas walls. Most of the bedrolls were empty. Emrick's was occupied. He was still unconscious, but breathing steadily, his color marginally better than it had been. The compress Cady had fashioned, replaced by proper bandaging. The young woman with the braids, she'd learned her name was Sina, sat beside him with a watchful expression. The voices were coming from outside. Cady stood, pressed her hand briefly to her newly stitched side to assess it, found it tolerable, and moved to the shelter door. There were 12 of them, standing in the snow outside the shelter in a loose formation that was trying to look informal and not quite managing it. The geometry was too deliberate, the spacing too considered. These were not wolves who had wandered together by coincidence. This was an organized arrival, and the man at the center of it was the kind of man who organized things. He was older than Evander by perhaps a decade. Mid-40s, with the broad, settled build of an alpha who'd held his position long enough that dominance had become structural. Something built into the way he occupied space rather than something he needed to actively project. Silver threaded through dark hair at his temples. His face was not unkind, exactly, but it was the face of a man who had made enough hard decisions that kindness had become a resource he rationed carefully. And Evander stood opposite him. The distance between them was roughly 10 feet, and it was not casual distance. It was the specific, charged gap that formed between two dominant wolves who were managing a disagreement with the thin veneer of civilized discourse stretched over something that wanted very much to be a confrontation. "You were supposed to bring the pack south 3 days ago," the older man was saying. His voice was controlled, measured. The control of it made it more pointed, not less. "The Solstice Accord meeting begins at sundown tomorrow. Your absence sends a message you can't afford to send right now, Evander." "My brother was attacked on pack territory," Evander said. His voice was quieter than the older man's and somehow carried further. "I don't leave my own behind." Emmerich made his choices. He went ahead without authorization. He was tracking a threat that crossed our northern boundary, and you know it, Aldrich. The older man, Aldrich, drew a breath through his nose. His eyes moved, briefly and with visible purpose, past Evander's shoulder to the shelter door. To Caddy, standing in it. He looked at her for a long moment. She had the deeply unpleasant experience of being assessed and categorized in the space of approximately 4 seconds, with the particular efficiency of a man who'd had a lot of practice deciding what things were worth and what they weren't. "Is that her?" he said. Not a question. Evander didn't turn around. "That's not your concern." "It is absolutely my concern." Aldrich's voice changed, the careful control developing a hairline fracture that let something colder through. "A lone wolf. No pack claim. No alpha bond. Carrying something that half the northern territories are already frightened of, crossing Grafenland without permission, and now sheltered under your protection 2 days before the most politically sensitive meeting this council has held in 20 years. He paused. "Tell me which part of that isn't my concern." "All of it," Evander said flatly. "She's under my protection. That ends the conversation." It didn't end the conversation. Aldrich moved, not toward Evander, but to the side, a deliberate repositioning that brought him at a different angle to the shelter door. To Caddy. She held her ground. She was very good at holding her ground. "You're Caddy Voss," Aldrich said. "Formerly of the Ashenvale Pack. Exiled 3 years ago for—" "I wasn't exiled," she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. I left. The distinction matters less than you think in pack law." He held her gaze with the practiced ease of a man who'd used eye contact as a dominance tool for decades. "What matters is that you carry something the Ashenvale Alpha classified as a destabilizing force." His formal report to the council described his formal report, she said, was written by a man who was frightened of something he didn't understand and dressed his fear in administrative language. She let that sit for a second. "I've read pack law, Alpha Aldrich. A classification report from one Alpha without corroborating testimony from a council elder carries no enforceable weight outside that Alpha's territory." A pause. "Which means it carries no weight here." Silence. Several of the 12 wolves behind Aldrich shifted, not aggressively, more the small, involuntary movements of people recalibrating their assessment of a situation they'd walked into with assumptions. Aldrich looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected less. "She's educated," he said, to Evander rather than to her, as if she'd demonstrated a surprising trick. "She's standing right here," Caddy said. Evander made a sound, very low, very brief, that might, if she'd been in a more generous mood, have been a suppressed laugh. Aldrich's expression closed. "This isn't about pack law," he said, dropping the pretense of the administrative framing. "This is about optics, about what it looks like when the Alpha King arrives at the Solstice Accord with an unclaimed, unmarked she-wolf carrying a power that 3 separate northern packs have already flagged as a threat. Plus, it looks like a provocation. It looks like a declaration." He turned back to Evander fully, dismissing Caddy with the orientation of his body in a way that was both deliberate and revealing. "Send her away. Let her cross the southern boundary and wash your hands of it. The Accord is more important than one wolf." The morning was very quiet. Wind moved through the pines above. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a bird called once and went silent. Caddy stood in the shelter doorway and felt the stillness of the moment, the way you felt the stillness before a structure gave way. The specific second when all the weight was still being held, when nothing had yet fallen, when everything was still technically fine, she watched Evander. How she told herself she wasn't watching him the way she'd watched the Ashenvale Alpha 3 years ago, standing in that circle of faces, counting the moment when each one made its decision. She told herself this was different, that she knew better now, that she had built herself into someone who didn't need to be chosen because she'd stopped letting her survival depend on other people's choices. She told herself all of that. She watched him anyway. Evander was quiet for long enough that Aldrich began to shift. A barely perceptible change in his weight distribution, the posture of a man who thought he'd won. Then Evander said, "No." Single syllable. No elaboration. No negotiation. It landed with the particular finality of something that had been decided before the conversation began, before Aldrich's arrival, possibly before Caddy had woken up this morning. Aldrich stilled. "Evander, she stays." He turned and looked at Caddy in the doorway, and something passed across his face that she couldn't fully interpret but that moved through her chest regardless, warm and complicated, and something she firmly decided to examine later, when there were fewer immediate problems. Then he looked back at Aldrich. "She travels with us to the Accord, under my protection. Anyone who takes issue with that takes it up with me directly." He let a beat pass. "I'd encourage them to think carefully before doing that." The 12 wolves behind Aldrich exchanged looks. Aldrich looked at Evander for a long moment with the expression of a man filing something away for later use. Then he looked at Caddy one more time. A flat assessment. And whatever he found or didn't find in her face, he turned without another word and walked back into the trees. His wolves followed him in the careful, organized way of a formation that had been trained to retreat without looking like retreat. The clearing was quiet again. Caddy let out a breath she hadn't consciously been holding. Marin appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard her approach, and spoke in a low voice that didn't carry past the two of them. "Aldrich will move against you at the Accord," she said. "He's too politically careful to do it openly, but he'll find a mechanism, a procedural challenge, a formal petition to the council." She paused. "He's not wrong that your presence complicates things. He's just wrong about the solution." "I know," Caddy said. "You should also know," Marin continued, at her dark eyes moving to Evander's back as he crossed toward the shelter, "that what he just did, choosing you over a politically critical alliance in front of witnesses, is not something the Alpha King does lightly." She let that sit. "It is not something he has done before. For anyone." Caddy said nothing. Evander reached the doorway and stopped, looking at her. there was something in his expression that was carefully arranged, composed in the way things were composed when a great deal of effort had gone into the composition. "You should eat," he said. "We move in 2 hours." "To the Accord," she said. "To the Accord." She held his gaze, felt the thing in her chest hum quietly, insistently, the way it had been humming since the hollow in the snow last night, since the amber eyes, since the cave, since the symbols on the wall that matched the mark on her skin. "They'll come after me there," she said. "You know that." "I know," he said, "and you still want me there." He looked at her for a moment that stretched a beat longer than necessary. "I want you safe," he said. "The Accord is the safest place in the Northern Territories for the next 48 hours. 300 wolves, 12 alphas, council elders with enough combined authority to hold any aggression in check." He paused. "After that," something shifted in his expression. "After that, we'll face what comes." She studied him. The composed face, the amber eyes that held too much, too carefully. "You're not telling me everything," she said. "No," he agreed. Simply, without apology. She should have pushed back, should have demanded the full picture before agreeing to walk into a room full of wolves who already had reason to fear her. Should have invoked every hard-won instinct she'd developed across 3 years of surviving alone. Instead, she said, 2 hours, and went inside to eat. Behind the shelter, out of sight of everyone, in the narrow space between the rock face and the back canvas wall, one of Aldrich's wolves had not followed his alpha into the trees. He stood with a small communication device pressed against his ear, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes moving with the furtive speed of someone doing something they would not want witnessed. "She's confirmed," he said. "The mark, the light. It's real. She's traveling with them to the Accord." A pause, listening. "Understood. We move at the Accord. And make sure the council is primed before they arrive." Another pause, then quieter. "And the Alpha King?" He listened. His expression shifted to something complicated, something that might have been reluctance if reluctance hadn't been something he'd trained out of himself a long time ago. "Understood," he said again. He ended the communication, pocketed the device, smoothed his expression into something neutral, and walked back around the shelter to rejoin the others. The snow where he'd been standing held his footprints for a few minutes. Then the wind came and erased them. The opening ceremonies began at dawn. The basin transformed overnight. What had been a functional camp of separated territorial clusters became, in the gray morning light, something more deliberate. What the 12 pack banners were raised at the perimeter of a central gathering space, each one distinct in color and symbol, snapping in the cold mountain wind with the particular authority of things that represented more than fabric. Stone fire pits burned at the cardinal points. The council elders, 7 of them, ancient and unhurried, and carrying the specific gravity of people who'd watched generations of wolves make urgent decisions that turned out to be less urgent than advertised, took their positions at the head of the gathering space in high-backed chairs that had been carried here specifically for this purpose. 300 wolves arranged themselves in the space between. Hierarchy made itself visible without anyone announcing it. The senior alphas closest to the council, their seconds and thirds fanning outward behind them, thus the general pack membership filling the broad outer ring. It was the same instinctive geometry that pack gatherings had always produced, as natural and unthinking as water finding its level. Caddy stood at Evander's left shoulder. It was the position of a second, not a mate. That placement was different, carried different weight in pack protocol, but a second, which meant acknowledged protection, which meant anyone who wanted to challenge her presence had to formally challenge Evander's authority in extending it. It was, she understood, a deliberate and carefully calculated positioning. It was also, she was aware, the most exposed place she could possibly be, visible to every set of eyes in the basin, unmistakable, unambiguous. She kept her face forward and her hands still at her sides. The silver light was very quiet this morning, almost subdued. She'd felt it pressing at the edges of her containment since before dawn, not surging, not threatening, but present in a way it hadn't been since before the shrine. Like it was paying attention. Like it knew something was coming and was conserving itself accordingly. She didn't find that comforting. The elder at the center of the council, a woman so old her hair had gone completely white, and her face had become a map of every year she'd lived, raised one hand, and the gathered wolves went silent, with a speed and completeness that demonstrated, more than any formal demonstration could have, what genuine authority looked like. "The Solstice Accord convenes," she said. Her voice was not loud, it didn't need to be. "As it has convened for 400 years, in neutrality, and in the shared acknowledgement that what binds us is older and larger than what divides us." She lowered her hand. "We begin." The opening proceedings were formal and measured. Territorial reports from each alpha, brief and structured, touching on population stability, boundary integrity, resource status. Evander spoke when his turn came with the same economy he brought to everything, giving what was required without embellishment, his voice carrying through the cold air without effort. Cady listened. She listened and she watched, and she felt the attention of the gathering, the way you felt weather, the low pressure of it, the particular quality of 300 people being carefully aware of one specific point in the space they all occupied. She was that point. She'd known she would be. She'd prepared herself for it. And she hadn't prepared herself for where the first move came from. It was Sina, the young woman with the dark braids, 19 years old, wide, serious face, the one who'd brought Cady yarrow tea in the shelter with careful hands and careful eyes. The one who'd sat with Emmerich through the night, watching him breathe. The one Cady had, without entirely deciding to, begun to think of as someone safe. She stepped forward from Evander's pack cluster during the period of open address, the portion of the accord where any wolf of any rank could bring a matter before the council. And Cady registered her movement first as confused, then as wrong, then as the specific wrongness of something she should have seen and hadn't. "Elder Vassia," Sina said. Her voice was steady, more steady than 19 should have produced, which was its own information. "I bring a matter of safety before the council." Evander went very still beside Cady. Not the stillness of surprise. She registered that immediately, the stillness of someone receiving confirmation of something they'd feared. His eyes moved to Senna with an expression that held something she hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger. Something more complicated than anger. "Speak," Elder Vassia said. Senna turned. She didn't look at Evander. She didn't look at Cady immediately either. She looked at the council, at the elder, maintaining the formal address of the proceeding with the practiced ease of someone who'd been coached on exactly how to do this and by whom. "The wolf standing at the Alpha King's left shoulder," she said, "carries the silver flame." She paused to let that register through the gathering. And it did register, a murmur moving through 300 wolves like wind through grass. "I can confirm this as a direct witness. I observed the manifestation twice in the past 24 hours. I have also accessed..." She reached into her jacket and produced a folded document, which she carried to the council with measured steps. The formal classification report filed by Alpha Denon of the Ashenvale Pack 3 years ago, regarding this wolf's instability and the risk she poses to pack structures in her proximity. The elder took the document. Cady stood very still. She was aware of everything simultaneously. The document in the elder's hands, the murmur still moving through the crowd, Aldrich, standing at his position among the senior alphas, with an expression of studied neutrality that she now read perfectly, Evander rigid beside her with a quality of tension that was radiating from him like heat, the silver light in her chest waking up with a slow, terrible urgency. "You said," she said, quiet, to Evander, not accusatory. She didn't have the full picture yet, and she knew it, and she was not going to make the mistake of filling in blanks with assumptions. "You said you had people watching." "I did," he said, through his teeth, very controlled. "I was watching the wrong people." Senna had returned to the gathered wolves. She still hadn't looked at Cady directly. Elder Vassia read the document. The other 6 council elders leaned together in the low, a private consultation of people who developed their own communication shorthand over decades of shared decisions. Then a voice from the gathered alphas. Not Aldrich, someone else, a younger alpha from the Eastern Territories with a reputation for aggressive boundary enforcement that Cady had heard referenced twice in the last 24 hours, called out, "The council should note that the wolf in question entered Grayfen territory without permission. That's a protocol violation independent of the safety question." "Noted," Elder Vassia said, without looking up. "Furthermore," Aldrich said. And here it was. Here was the mechanism, smooth and inevitable, and timed with the precision of someone who'd been orchestrating it for days. "The council may wish to consider the implications of the Alpha King's choice to shelter this wolf. Under pack law, extending formal protection to an individual classified as a destabilizing force constitutes a material endorsement of that individual's presence in neutral territory. Which means the Alpha King's position on this matter is not neutral. Which means..." He paused. "The council should weigh his testimony accordingly." It was elegant. She had to give it that. In a single procedural move, Aldrich had made Evander's protection of her a liability rather than a shield. Had reframed it as a conflict of interest that undermined his ability to advocate for her. Had isolated her in the center of the gathering space as effectively as if he'd drawn a physical circle around her. And he'd used Senna to do it. Someone inside Evander's own pack. Someone who'd been watching and reporting and carrying the classified document through 6 hours of travel with the careful hands she'd also used to bring Cady Yarrow tea. The silver light surged. She pressed it down, hard. Felt it resist in a way it hadn't before, pushing back against her containment with a force that was less like a wave and more like something structural. Something load-bearing that had been compressed past its tolerance point. Not here, not now. The elder set the document down. "The council will hear from the wolf in question directly," she said. "Come forward." Cady stepped forward. She walked through the gathered wolves, through the parting space that opened before her, with the specific quality of people moving away from something they weren't sure about, and stopped before the council. 7 pairs of ancient eyes looked at her with the careful, deliberate attention of people who'd made consequential decisions for so long they'd stopped being afraid of them. She stood straight. She breathed. "Your name," the elder said. "Cady Voss. The classification report before us describes you as a destabilizing force, as a wolf whose power manifested outside of pack structure and control, causing fear and instability within your birth pack." Elder Vassia held her gaze. "Do you dispute this account?" "I dispute the conclusion," Cady said, "not the events." She kept her voice level. "My shift changed 3 years ago. Something in my bloodline activated that I didn't understand, and my pack didn't understand. My alpha's response was fear. His classification report is an accurate record of that fear." She paused. It is not an accurate assessment of what I am." "And what are you?" another elder asked. She opened her mouth. And from behind her, from somewhere in the gathered wolves, a voice she hadn't heard before, a voice that was old in a way that had nothing to do with age, a voice that seemed to arrive from multiple directions simultaneously, said, "She is the Silver Warden, and your quarrel with her is a quarrel with the moon itself." The gathering erupted. Not violently. The council's presence prevented that, but in the way that 300 people responding simultaneously to something that reconfigured their understanding of a situation erupted, a wave of sound and movement and the realignment of attention. Heads turned. People shifted. The fire pits at the cardinal points flared simultaneously, briefly, with no visible cause. A caddy turned. The woman standing at the edge of the gathering space was small and ancient and completely unknown to her. A face she'd never seen, a presence she'd never felt, wearing the layered gray clothing of a Lunara elder that she recognized from descriptions in pack history she'd read years ago. No pack marking, no alpha bond. Traveling alone, which for a woman of her apparent age in this terrain was either remarkable or impossible. The 7 council elders had gone very still. Elder Vassia rose from her chair, and Catty realized, watching the most powerful elder at the accord stand in deference to this small, ancient woman, that she was witnessing a hierarchy she hadn't known existed. "Keeper Aldana," Elder Vassia said. Her voice held something Catty hadn't heard in it before. "Well, we were not informed of your attendance." "I don't inform," Keeper Aldana said pleasantly. "I arrive." She moved through the gathered wolves, who stepped aside with an automaticity that suggested they were responding to something below conscious decision-making. She stopped in front of Catty and looked up at her. She was a full foot shorter, which made the quality of her gaze extraordinary in its effect. Black eyes, utterly still. "Show them," she said quietly. Only to Catty. "I can't control it," Catty said, just as quietly. "You've been controlling it for 3 years," Keeper Aldana said. "I'm asking you to stop." The silver light slammed against the inside of her chest. "Show them," the old woman said again. And Catty, who had spent 3 years pressing it down, who had built her entire survival around the practice of containment, and who had run and hidden and exhausted herself with the endless effort of making herself small enough to be safe, let go. The silver light rose through her like a tide, up from her center, through her chest, into her arms, into her hands, into her skin. And this time she didn't fight it, didn't redirect it, didn't press it back into the dark place where she kept it stored between moments. She let it come, and it came like something that had been waiting to be invited for a very long time, and was not particularly interested in being subtle about its arrival. The light burst from her in a wave, silver and absolute and cold as moonlight. It radiated outward across the basin floor, illuminating every face, casting every shadow in sharp relief, rising to the canopy of pine branches above and then beyond, and shooting skyward in a column that, she would be told later by people who'd been outside the basin, was visible for 40 miles. The 12 pack banners cracked in unison above them. The cardinal fire pits went white. 300 wolves stood in silver light and were absolutely, completely silent. Catty stood at the center of it and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the terrifying, exhilarating, bone-deep relief of not having to pretend it wasn't there. Then she felt something else. A hand. On her arm. Warm and steady and unmistakable. Evander. Standing beside her in the silver light with his jaw set, and his eyes amber bright, and his hand wrapped around her forearm with the specific grip of someone who was not there to restrain her, who was there to anchor her. "I've got you," he said. She looked at him. "I've got you," he said again. Steadier. And from the council, Aldrich's voice, stripped now of its careful diplomatic layering, showing something rawer beneath. "This proves nothing except the danger. The council must act. She'll destroy everything. The prophecy says her power will. The prophecy, Keeper Aldana said, cutting through him like a blade through silk, says no such thing. You've been reading the corrupted text. She looked at the council. I have the original. She reached into her layers and produced a small, ancient book, its cover worn to the texture of skin, and it tells a very different story. The light in Caddy's hands continued to rise. And somewhere deep in the forest beyond the basin's rim, in a darkness that the silver light had not yet reached, and something that was not a wolf and was not human, lifted its head at the pillar of light and smiled. The silver light didn't fade. That was the first thing everyone in the basin understood simultaneously, that this was not a flare, not a burst of uncontrolled emotion that would peak and subside the way power did when it operated outside of the person carrying it. This was sustained, deliberate. The light moved with Caddy's breathing, rose and fell with the rhythm of her chest, and the quality of it had shifted from the raw, flooding release of a moment ago into something more refined, more intentional, like the difference between water breaking through a dam and water moving through a channel it had carved for itself over time. She was holding it, not containing it, holding it. But the distinction was enormous, and she felt it in every cell of her body. The difference between a fist clenched against something and an open hand around it. 3 years of containment had taught her the shape of the light from the outside, its pressure points, its surge patterns, the specific moments when it pushed hardest. What she hadn't understood, what no one had helped her understand, was that the light had a shape from the inside too, that it wasn't formless, that it wasn't chaotic, that it had, and this was the word that arrived in her mind fully formed and undeniable, intention. It knew what it was for. Keeper Aldana stood before the council with the ancient book open in her small, weathered hands, reading in a voice that was quiet, but somehow occupied every corner of the basin simultaneously. Yet the gathered wolves were still, not frozen, not paralyzed, but held in the specific stillness of people encountering something that required their full attention, and they knew it. The Silver Warden does not destroy, Keeper Aldana read. She restores. She is born in fracture and carries the light that preceded the first law, the light from which all pack bonds were originally drawn. Her power does not threaten the structure. She is the structure, remembered. Aldrich's voice cut across the reading. That translation is contested. By whom? Keeper Aldana asked. She didn't look up from the book. By 3 separate council scholars who reviewed the original text in The 3 Scholars You Commissioned and Paid For. She closed the book with a sound like a single quiet drumbeat. Yes, I'm aware. She finally looked at him. I wrote the original text, Alpha Aldrich. I don't require a translation. The silence that followed had a particular texture. The texture of a room where the ground had shifted under everyone's feet simultaneously, and no one had yet decided how to redistribute their weight. Caddy stood in the silver light and processed this information about the woman beside her, that she was not just a Lunara elder, not just a keeper in the administrative sense of the title, that she was something older than that, something that didn't fit into the categories Caddy had been working with. She filed it under address later and returned her attention to the immediate situation, which was deteriorating in a direction she hadn't yet fully mapped, because Aldrich was not done. But she could see it in him, the way a man looked when he'd planned for multiple outcomes and was pivoting to the contingency he'd hoped not to need. His eyes moved briefly to the forest beyond the basin's northern rim and then back to the gathering. And something in that glance, the specific direction of it, the brevity, the quality of checking rather than looking, lit every nerve in her body simultaneously. Evander, she said quietly. He was already looking at the northern tree line. I see it, he said. They came out of the forest in a line, not wolves. That was the first wrong thing. In a gathering of 300 shifters on the night before a full moon, with pack bonds humming at maximum resonance, anything approaching from the outside should have triggered an immediate cascade of warning, scent, sound, and the low-frequency awareness that packs maintained at the perimeter of their collective attention. Nothing had triggered. Nothing had warned. They moved through the trees and into the basin's edge with the particular wrongness of things that existed in the gaps of normal perception, that slid past the senses, the way certain colors slid past certain types of vision. Shadow beasts. She'd heard of them. Every wolf had, in the same way you had heard of things that occupied the outer edge of the tradition, the cautionary mythology, the stories told in low voices around fires that were meant less as entertainment and more as warning. Ancient constructs bound to will rather than bloodline that could be called and directed by someone with the specific and very old knowledge of how to do it. There were 11 of them, at each one roughly wolf-shaped, but wrong in its proportions. Too large, too dark, with a quality of absence at their edges where the silver light touched them and seemed to stop rather than illuminate. Their eyes were pale, empty in the way that things were empty when the thing that should have been behind the eyes had been replaced with something purely functional. 300 wolves reacted simultaneously. The basin exploded into controlled chaos. Alphas calling their packs into formation, the council elders rising from their chairs with a speed that belied their apparent age, Evander's pack clustering and shifting in the specific coordinated pattern of wolves who'd trained together long enough that the response was automatic. Evander himself shifted, not entirely, as the half shift that gave his hands claws and his eyes the full amber of his wolf form, while he remained upright, and moved into the space between Caddy and the approaching constructs with a speed that was simply not arguable. "Get to the center of the basin," he said. Not to her specifically. To his pack, to the council, to the non-combatants. Away from the tree line. "I'm not going to the center of the basin," Caddy said. He looked at her. "They came from the north," she said. The direction Aldrich looked before they appeared. She held his gaze. "This is the contingency. If the council proceeding failed, this was next." His jaw set. Something moved through his amber eyes. Not disbelief, she registered with a kind of grim satisfaction. He was already arriving at the same conclusion. He can't control shadow beasts himself," Evander said. "He doesn't have the knowledge." "No," she agreed. "But someone who does could do it for him. Someone who's been operating in the gaps between territories for long enough that no one's mapped them." She looked at the 11 constructs advancing in a slow, deliberate line. Someone who's been using the destabilization of the pack structure, the fear around the silver flame, the corrupted prophecy text, all of it, to keep everyone looking in the wrong direction. "While they moved freely," Evander said. "While they moved freely." The shadow beasts were 40 yards out. 35. Several of Evander's wolves had engaged the outer constructs in a fighting retreat, buying time, slowing the advance. But shadow beasts didn't fight the way physical opponents did. You couldn't tire them, but you couldn't wound them in any way that mattered. You could redirect them, deflect them, delay them. But the only thing that actually stopped a shadow beast was the power that had summoned it, withdrawn, or something older than the power that made it. Keeper Aldana appeared at Caddy's left side. She moved with the unhurried quality of someone who'd watched a great many crises unfold and had learned to distinguish the ones that required urgency from the ones that required clarity. "You know what to do," the old woman said. "I've never used it offensively," Caddy said. "I've never used it at all. Tonight was the first time I've let it out without trying to stop it immediately." "You've been using it for 3 years," Keeper Aldana said. "You've been using it wrong, which is different from not using it." She looked up at Caddy with those absolutely still black eyes. "The light doesn't attack. It reveals. It restores. point it at something built from shadow and intention, and show it what it actually is. Which is what? Nothing, the old woman said simply. Shadow beasts are elaborate nothings, very convincing nothings, but nothings nonetheless. 25 yards. One of Evander's wolves went down. Not killed. The constructs weren't killing. Caddy registered that with the part of her mind that was cataloging everything simultaneously, they were herding, driving the pack toward the center of the basin, away from the perimeter, creating a compressed space, creating a target. She looked at the center of the basin, at the 300 wolves being funneled there, at the clearing that was forming as the shadow beasts advanced from the north and east simultaneously, a coordinated movement that would put every wolf in the accord in one concentrated location. She looked at the sky above that location. She looked back at the tree line, and she saw him. Standing at the edge of the forest, half in shadow, watching the herding operation with the still, assessing patience of someone who'd planned a very long time for this moment. Not Aldrich. Aldrich was, she now understood, a useful instrument, not the hand that held it. This was someone else. Someone she didn't know by face but recognized by quality. The specific quality of a person who had decided, at some point far back, that the pack structure was a constraint rather than a community, and had spent the years since working methodically to dismantle it. When he felt her looking, he looked back and he smiled. Something moved through Caddy that was not fear and was not anger, and was not quite either of the things she had vocabulary for. It was older than those things, older than her, older than 3 years of running or 22 years of ordinary life before the shift changed. It moved through her from the soles of her feet to the crown of her head like a current finding its ground at last, and the silver light responded to it with a completeness that erased every remaining question about whether she could control it. She could. She could because it wasn't separate from her. It never had been. She walked forward. Caddy. Evander's voice. Behind her. She didn't stop. Caddy! He was beside her immediately, matching her pace, and she felt his hand find her arm, not restraining, anchoring, had the same grip as before, the same message. Stay with me, she said, not asking, telling, a beat. Then, always. She walked forward into the space between the shadow beasts and the retreating pack, and she stopped, and she breathed, and she opened her hands. The silver light came up from the ground beneath her feet. She hadn't done that before. Hadn't known she could. But it rose from the earth under her like something that had been stored there. Like the mountain itself had been holding it in reserve, keeping it safe, waiting for the specific person and the specific moment that justified the release. It rose through the soles of her boots and up through her legs, and joined with the light already moving through her chest and arms and hands, and the joined thing was categorically larger than either component had been separately. The shadow beasts stopped, not retreated, stopped. The way things stopped when they encountered something their programming hadn't accounted for. The man at the tree line's expression changed. She raised her hands. The light went out from her in every direction simultaneously. Not the wave of before, not the directed beam she might have expected from something that felt like an offensive action. It went out like dawn. Like the specific quality of light that arrived before sunrise, that moved across the landscape horizontally rather than falling from above, that found every shadow and illuminated it, not by overpowering it, but by simply being present in the space it had occupied. The shadow beasts came apart. Not dramatically, not with the explosive dissolution she'd seen in the stories, showed the cinematic unraveling of dark constructs in heroic light. They came apart the way fog came apart when the temperature changed, gradually, from the edges inward, losing coherence, losing the intention that had held them together, until the space they'd occupied was just space again. Empty. Ordinary. The way it had been before someone had filled it with elaborate nothing. 11 beasts. Gone in 40 seconds. The basin was silent except for the breathing of 300 wolves and the low wind moving through the pines above. Caddy lowered her hands. The light remained. Softer now, ambient. Distributed through the basin the way warmth distributed through a room. Not blinding, not overwhelming, simply present. She looked at the tree line. He was still there. The man at the edge of the forest. His smile was gone. And in its place was something more honest, the expression of a person recalculating from scratch, working through new information with the focused, efficient intelligence of someone who'd survived this long, precisely because they didn't let surprise become paralysis. He took one step back into the shadow. "He's going to run," Evander said beside her. "I know," she said. "We'll lose him in the forest." "I know that too." She looked at the space where the man had been standing, already deeper in the trees now, already swallowed by the dark. She looked at the silver light in her hands, which was still present. Still hers. Not going anywhere. She thought about 11 days of running. About 3 years before that of containing and suppressing and making herself small enough to be tolerated. About 22 years before that of being ordinary, of thinking ordinary was what she was, of not knowing yet that she was carrying something ancient and enormous and entirely, specifically hers. She thought about a wolf in a blood-red hollow with amber eyes that had looked at her like recognition. She looked at Evander. "Next time," she said. He looked at her steadily. The amber eyes, the composed face, the quality of presence that had been rearranging the space around her since the first moment she'd seen him in the forest. "Next time," he agreed. From the gathered wolves behind them, 300 of them, 12 packs, centuries of territorial division and political calculation, and the accumulated hierarchy of a world that ran on dominance and bloodline, a sound began. Low at first, almost inaudible, at the specific resonance of a wolf pack acknowledging something. Not Evander, her. It moved through the basin like the light had moved. From the edges inward. Building. Deepening. Until it occupied the space fully. Until it was unmistakable. Keeper Aldana put one small hand briefly on Caddy's arm. "There it is," the old woman said quietly. "There you are." And the silver light, unhurried and uncontained and entirely without apology, continued to glow. The basin was quiet in the way that places became quiet after something enormous had moved through them. Not empty quiet. Not the quiet of absence. The specific, weighted quiet of 300 people standing in the aftermath of something that had permanently rearranged their understanding of the world they lived in. The quiet of recalibration, of 300 individual minds working through the same fundamental question from 300 different angles. The silver light had softened to something ambient and low, threading through the basin like moonlight through water. And in it, every face carried the particular quality of a person encountering something they had no existing category for. Caddy stood in the center of it and felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely still. Not numb, not shut down. Still in the way a body became still when it had finally stopped bracing for impact. When the thing it had been running from had arrived and passed through and left her standing, and she was discovering, with the particular shock of someone who'd built their entire existence around motion, that standing was something she still knew how to do. Evander was beside her. He hadn't moved from her side since he'd matched her stride, walking into the path of 11 shadow beasts with nothing between them and the constructs except her outstretched hands and a quality of conviction she hadn't known she possessed until it was required. He was beside her now with that same steadiness, not hovering, not performing reassurance, simply present in the specific, uncomplicated way that certain people were present. The way that didn't demand anything from you in return. She was becoming dangerously accustomed to it. Aldrich had been taken into council custody, quietly, efficiently, with the particular lack of drama that the most significant things often carried. His two council guards had simply appeared at his shoulders during the chaos of the Shadow Beast dissolution, and he had looked at them and made the intelligent calculation that resistance was not currently his most viable option. He'd gone with them without a word, his expression locked into something careful and neutral, his eyes moving once to Caddy's face as he passed. She held his gaze. He looked away first. Senna had not been taken into custody. She'd stood at the edge of Evander's pack cluster through the entire encounter with the expression of someone watching the consequences of their choices arrive in real time. Not with defiance, not with justification, but with the particular quality of a very young person discovering that the thing they'd been told they were doing and the thing they'd actually done were not the same. She was 19. She'd been recruited by someone who'd known exactly which levers to use on a 19-year-old with strong pack loyalty and the specific vulnerability of believing she was protecting the people she loved. Caddy understood that. She didn't forgive it yet. Forgiveness required time and distance and more information than she currently had. But she understood the architecture of it. Emmerich, brought out of the medical tent when the commotion had reached a volume that even unconsciousness couldn't filter, was sitting upright on a cot someone had carried to the tent entrance, watching the basin with the wide-eyed expression of a 24-year-old who had missed the most significant event of his generation by approximately 3 hours and was going to be processing that particular injustice for a very long time. Then he caught Caddy's eye across the distance and gave her a look that was equal parts mortification and gratitude and something else. Something that looked a lot like the expression Evander wore when he was feeling more than he'd budgeted for. Brothers, she thought. Same eyes, same tells. She would have smiled if she'd been the smiling type. Keeper Aldana found her an hour later. The basin had settled into something approaching normalcy. The particular normalcy of a community reassembling its routines after disruption. The conscious choice to return to familiar patterns as a way of processing unfamiliar events. Fires were tended. Food appeared. The low murmur of conversation picked up its rhythm again, different now in texture, more uncertain, more questioning, but moving in the direction of something rather than away from it. Caddy was sitting on the northern slope of the basin above the main camp, where the tree line began and the snow was untouched, and she could see the whole spread of it below her. The fires, the banners. 300 lives arranged around the fact of what she carried, working out what it meant for each of them. Keeper Aldana sat beside her without being invited and without requiring an invitation. She sat the way ancient things sat, as though the ground had been waiting for them specifically. He got away, Caddy said. Yes. You knew he would. I suspected. The old woman was quiet for a moment, looking at the basin below them. He's been operating for a very long time. People who operate that long develop very good exit strategies. Who is he? That, Keeper Aldana said, is the question that comes next. She looked at Caddy sidelong. For tonight, I want you to sit with what you did, what you felt. The difference between what it was to carry it contained and what it is to carry it open. Caddy was quiet for a moment. The silver light had receded to the faintest luminescence at her fingertips. Not gone, not suppressed, just resting. The distinction was everything. It doesn't hurt, she said. She sounded faintly surprised by her own words. No, Keeper Eldana agreed. It never did. The pain was always the containing. She sat with that. Let it move through her and find all the places where it was relevant, which was most of them. 3 years, she said. 3 years, the old woman echoed, not with pity, but with the acknowledgement of someone who understood the cost of things and didn't minimize them by softening the numbers. You carried it alone for 3 years and you didn't break. That is not a small thing, Catti Voss. That is an enormous thing. The prophecy describes the Silver Warden as someone forged in isolation. She paused. The texts don't say that approvingly. They say it with grief. The way you'd describe a blade that had to be hammered cold because no forge was available. She looked at the basin below. You were hammered cold, and you held. Catti looked at her hands, at the faint silver at the edges of her fingers. And now? She asked. Now there's a forge, the old woman said simply. Evander found her when Keeper Eldana had gone, but he came up the slope with the quiet efficiency of someone who moved through terrain the way terrain was meant to be moved through, without fighting it, without making it accommodate him, just finding the path that was already there. He sat beside her without the performance of settling, the way people who were genuinely comfortable in their bodies sat, close enough that the warmth of him reached her through the cold night air. He didn't say anything immediately. Neither did she. That was its own kind of remarkable. The quality of the silence between them, which had none of the discomfort of silence between people who didn't know each other well enough to fill it without effort. Yet it was the silence of people who were in the process of becoming something they didn't have a word for yet, and were allowing the process, without demanding it, arrive at a named destination on schedule. Senna, she said eventually. I know. She's young. She is. His voice was careful. She was approached 4 months ago by someone inside the Accord network. Someone with the right language. Pack safety. Protecting Evander from a threat he couldn't see clearly because he was too close to it. He paused. She thought she was doing the right thing. She might have been, Catti said, from where she was standing, with the information she had. He looked at her. You're being very generous to someone who handed a classified document to a council that was trying to remove you. I've made decisions based on incomplete information, she said. More than once. The consequences found me eventually. She looked at the fires below. I'm not interested in becoming someone who forgets what that feels like. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she asked to speak with you when you're ready, if you're willing. I'll be willing, she said. Not tonight. Not tonight, he agreed. Another silence. The moon was high above the basin now. 3 days from full, round, and bright, and casting the snow in silver that was slightly different from hers, warmer toned, gentler. She looked at it and felt the pull of it the way she'd always felt it. The specific, low-frequency resonance of the moon on Wolfblood, which wasn't mystical, wasn't poetic, was simply biological and real, and something she'd lived inside her whole life. It felt different now that she knew what she was carrying. What happens after the Accord? She asked. He turned to look at her. What do you want to happen? She almost deflected. The habit was so deeply built. The automatic redirection away from questions about what she wanted, because wants required a future you were planning to inhabit. And she'd stopped planning futures 3 years ago and learned to live entirely in the present tense of survival. She didn't deflect. I want to find him, she said. The man in the trees. I want to understand what he's actually building. Not the shadow beasts, not the corrupted text, not Aldrich. The actual architecture of it. She paused. And I want to understand what I am well enough to be useful against it. Not just reactive. Actual, intentional, chosen use. She looked at him. I want to stop running. He held her gaze for a long moment. that his amber eyes in the moonlight were warm and very steady. "Then stop," he said, as "it's not that simple." "I know, but it starts with the decision." He paused. "And then it starts with the next thing, and the next." He looked at her hands, at the faint silver light at her fingertips. "You don't have to do any of it alone." She looked at him, at the face that had been the first thing she'd seen when she'd stood in the forest, with her knife between herself and the unknown, when the entire world had been hunters, and cold and a dying wolf in a blood-red hollow. The face that had known her name before she'd given it. That had said no in a single syllable and meant it. That had walked beside her into the path of 11 shadow constructs without being asked and without hesitating. She didn't touch his face. She wanted to. Yet she decided that was information worth having and filed it somewhere accessible. "The man in the trees said something," she said, "before he stepped back. I was the only one close enough to hear it." Evander stilled. "What did he say?" She looked at the moon. "He said..." This was just the introduction. The basin below them was warm with firelight. 300 wolves moving through their evening routines, readjusting, recalibrating, beginning the slow process of integrating something enormous into the framework of what they understood the world to be. She could feel them, faintly, distantly, the low hum of 300 pack bonds operating in the same space. Not her bonds, not her pack, but present, tangible, pointing towards something she didn't have language for yet. She felt Evander's hand settle over hers. Warm, still, not demanding anything. She turned her palm up and let his fingers find hers. So here is the question that will stay with you long after this story ends. When Caddy knelt in the blood-red snow beside a dying wolf she didn't know, when she stripped off her jacket in the freezing dark with hunters closing in and a wound bleeding through her side, when she chose to stay instead of run, when she chose presence over survival even when survival was the smarter option. Would you have done the same? When the pack circled her and the alpha looked at her with what instead of who, when the person who was supposed to protect her decided that her difference was a threat and her power was a liability and her presence was a problem to be managed, when she walked away before they watched her go, Erlen carried that alone for 3 years. Would you have understood her? When Evander stood in that clearing and said no, when he chose one woman over a politically critical alliance, over the approval of his council, over the ease of the path that cost him nothing, when he walked beside her into the path of something that could have ended him without hesitation, would you have believed him? And when the light finally came, when Caddy stopped pressing it down and let it rise, when she stopped apologizing for the size of what she carried and stood in the center of it without flinching, would you have feared her? Or would you have finally seen her? These are not simple questions. They don't have simple answers. That's why we tell stories like this one. Not to give you answers, but to sit with you in the questions. To find the places in you that recognize something in her, the part that has been containing something for too long, the part that has been told it was too much and believed it, the part that has been running from its own light because the people around it didn't know what to do with illumination. She saved a dying wolf in the snow. And in doing that, in making that one choice in that one freezing, bleeding, hunted moment, she began to save herself. That's how it always works, isn't it? The thing that saves us rarely looks like salvation when it arrives. It looks like inconvenience. It looks like risk. It looks like stopping when every intelligent thought you have is screaming at you to keep running. It looks like a pair of amber eyes in the dark that know your name before you've given it. It looks like letting go. If this story reached something in you, if you felt Caddy's exhaustion in your own chest, if you recognized the weight of carrying something too big for too long in silence, if some part of you stood in that basin and felt the silver light rise. Then you're home. Subscribe to Luna's Alpha Tales right now. Hit that bell so you never miss a story, because this is what we do here. We tell the stories that find the places in you that other stories don't reach. We tell the ones about women who were told they were too much and turned out to be exactly enough. We tell the ones about love that shows up not as rescue, but as witness. We tell the ones that leave something burning in your chest long after the last word. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in that hollow? Would you have kept running? Or would those amber eyes have stopped you too? We are here. Every story. Every time. Because here, we tell tales that burn. The moon reached its peak somewhere around the 3rd hour past midnight. The basin had quieted by degrees. The fires burned lower. The conversations dissolved into sleep. The 300 wolves of 12 separate packs settling into the particular rhythm of a large community at rest. It was the kind of quiet that had texture to it, that you could almost press your hand against and feel the warmth of all those lives arranged together in the dark, breathing in the loose, unconscious synchrony that pack proximity produced without anyone deciding to. Caddy noticed it because she was still awake. She'd moved back down from the slope an hour ago, and after Evander had finally been pulled away by the administrative necessity of his position, there were formal proceedings to document, council communications to draft, the complicated political aftermath of Aldrich's detention to begin navigating. He'd gone with the particular reluctance of a man who'd gotten very good at doing what was required, and hadn't previously had strong feelings about the cost of it. He'd looked back at her once from the bottom of the slope. She'd still been sitting in the snow with the moonlight on her hands and the silver light resting at her fingertips. She'd nodded. He'd gone. She was in her tent now, sitting cross-legged on the bedroll with her back against the center tent pole and Keeper Aldana's ancient book open in her lap. How the old woman had pressed it into her hands before disappearing, with the same abrupt, unhurried quality she'd arrived with, shortly after Evander had left. No instructions. No guidance on what to look for. Just the book, transferred with the matter-of-fact purposefulness of someone passing a tool to the person who was going to need it next. Caddy had been reading for 2 hours. The text was old. Older than old, written in a hand that had clearly been formed before the standardization of pack script. The letters slightly different in proportion and angle, in a way that required adjustment before you could move through it at speed. But the language itself was clear, directional, written. She'd come to understand, not as mythology or prophecy in the conventional sense, not as the elevated, an abstracted language of things meant to be interpreted from a distance, but as record, as documentation, as the precise, particular account of someone who had witnessed things and was writing them down so that the next person wouldn't have to start from nothing. There had been 8 Silver Wardens before her, 8 women across 4 centuries who had carried the light, who had appeared at moments of fracture in the pack world, who had, in every recorded case, arrived alone, without understanding what they carried, and spent years running from it before something or someone stopped the running. The records of each were different in their specifics, different territories, different centuries, different configurations of threat and opposition. But the shape of each story held a common architecture that she recognized. Not abstractly, not as pattern, but viscerally, in her own body, in the specific places where things had happened to her that she'd thought were hers alone. None of them had been alone. Each record included a secondary figure, always different, always particular to the circumstances, but always present. Someone who had known before the warden herself did. someone who had found her in the moment of greatest isolation and chosen, against political calculation and self-interest and every reasonable argument to the contrary, to stay. She turned to the 9th record. The pages were blank. Not worn blank, not faded or damaged, deliberately blank. The way pages were left when they were waiting. When the record hadn't been written yet, because the events it would document were still unfolding. Yoshi ran her fingers across the empty page and felt the texture of the paper, old and fine and somehow warm in a way that paper shouldn't have been warm. And the silver light in her hands responded, moving gently across the surface without her choosing to direct it. Not writing anything, just touching, just being present in the same space as something that had been waiting for her. She closed the book. She set it beside the bedroll. She lay back and looked at the ceiling of the tent and listened to the basin breathe around her. 300 wolves and the low wind and the settling sound of fires burning down to coals. And she felt, for the first time in 3 years, the specific quality of a future she was willing to think about, that she was willing to walk toward rather than away from, that had enough in it to be worth the walking. She was almost asleep when she heard it. Not a sound exactly. More a change in the quality of the silence. A shift in the particular texture of the night around the camp. Barely perceptible. The kind of change that registered in the body before the mind caught up. That moved through the nervous system as a low-grade warning before it assembled itself into anything nameable. She was upright before she'd consciously decided to be. Hand on her knife. Eyes moving to the tent entrance. Listening. The basin was still. The fires were coals. The breathing of 300 wolves continued in its loose, unconscious rhythm, and then, from somewhere in the dark outside the basin's rim, somewhere in the deep forest beyond the tree line on the eastern slope, something moved. Not the man from the trees. She knew his quality now. Ed had cataloged it in the specific way you cataloged things that had tried to hurt you. She would recognize his presence again before she saw him. This was different. Older. Heavier. Moving through the forest with the particular weight of something that had been in that forest for a very long time and was only now choosing to be perceptible. She stood, moved to the tent entrance, parted the flap, and looked out at the dark basin, the sleeping camp, the mountain ridges rising black against a sky full of stars. Nothing visible. She was about to step back inside when the ground moved. Not violently. Not the sharp, decisive jolt of seismic activity. Something slower. A deep, a foundational tremor that moved through the earth beneath her feet and continued upward through her legs and into her spine with the specific quality of something communicating rather than threatening. She'd felt something like it twice before, once in the shrine when the symbols had lit around her, and once tonight when the light had come up through the ground in the basin. But this was neither of those things. This was deeper. This was coming from further down than the mountain. The silver light in her hands came up immediately, bright and responsive, illuminating the snow around the tent entrance in a circle of pale light. She turned slowly, scanning, assessing, the eastern tree line. Movement. Not the shadow beasts. She knew their quality too, the specific absence at their edges where light stopped rather than reflected. But this was something that reflected. Something that gathered the ambient light of the stars and the coals and her own silver glow and gave it back slightly differently. The way certain animals' eyes gave back light at night. Except this was not an animal's eyes. It was a wolf. Enormous. Larger than Emmerich had been in his animal form, which had already been the largest wolf she'd seen. This one was... She struggled for the word, standing in the dark with the silver light at her hands, and the tremor still moving through the ground beneath her, architectural. The way certain things were architectural, built for something beyond ordinary function. The way mountains were architectural. Its fur was white. Not gray white or silver white. White the way snow was white before anything touched it. White that had no other color in it. And it stood at the eastern tree line and looked at her. She looked back. The tremor in the ground deepened for one long, deliberate moment. She felt it in her back teeth, and then subsided entirely, leaving the basin absolutely still in its wake. The white wolf took one step forward from the trees, into the ambient light of the coals and the stars, and her silver glow. Close enough now that she could see its eyes. Not amber, not the pale emptiness of the shadow beasts. Silver, the exact shade and quality as the light in her own hands. Her breath left her slowly. She didn't replace it immediately. She stood in the entrance of her tent in the sleeping camp, with 300 wolves unconscious around her, and looked at an animal she had no category for, no pack record, no mythology, no entry in Keeper Aldana's ancient book that she'd been able to find, and felt the vibration in her chest respond to it the way it responded to things that mattered. The white wolf looked at her for a long moment. Then it turned its head, deliberately, not startled, not fleeing, toward the deep forest to the east. Looked back at her. Looked east again. She understood the communication perfectly. She didn't move. Not because she was afraid, the fear was present but not primary. Because she was smart enough to know that the middle of a sleeping accord camp 2 days after 11 shadow beasts had materialized from the northern tree line was not the moment to follow an unknown white wolf into a dark forest alone. But she looked where it had indicated. East. Into the dark. And from the dark, faint, distant, it carried on the cold mountain air like something that had traveled a very long way to arrive here, came a sound, a howl. Not one howl, many, layered and overlapping and coming from multiple directions simultaneously, from distances that shouldn't have been audible at this range, from sources that shouldn't have been coordinated without a signal she'd have detected. Wolves she didn't know. Packs she hadn't heard of. Somewhere in the vast, unmapped dark of the Eastern Territories, beyond the boundaries of anything the Accord had documented or claimed. The white wolf looked at her one final time. Then it walked back into the trees and was gone. The silver light in Caddy's hands burned steady and bright in the aftermath, illuminating the empty tree line, the untouched snow, or the space where something enormous had briefly been and wasn't anymore. She went to Keeper Aldana's tent. The old woman was awake. Of course she was awake. She was sitting in the center of her bedroll with the particular composed quality of someone who had not been sleeping and had not been surprised by the sound of the footsteps approaching. "The white wolf," Caddy said. "Yes," Keeper Aldana said. "You knew it was here." "I suspected it was coming." She looked at Caddy with those absolutely still black eyes. "Sit down." Caddy sat. "The 9 records in my book," the old woman said. 8 documented. 1 unwritten. She folded her hands in her lap. "There is a 10th. One that predates my record keeping. One that I did not document, because when it occurred, I did not yet understand what I was witnessing." She paused. At the lantern between them threw warm light across her ancient face. The first Silver Warden, the original, before the others, before the cycle, before the fractures that made the cycle necessary. "What happened to her?" Caddy asked. "She didn't finish," Keeper Aldana said simply. "She came as close as anyone has come, closer than any of the 8 who followed her, but the force she was moving against was larger than she anticipated, and she faced it before she was ready, and she—" A pause. "She chose to contain it rather than defeat it. She folded it into herself and held it there and gave the pack world 4 centuries of relative stability, at the cost of her own continuation. The tent was very quiet. "The White Wolf," Caddy said slowly. "Is it—" "A message," Keeper Eldana said, "from something very old. Shim telling you that the thing she contained for 4 centuries is no longer fully contained." She held Caddy's gaze steadily. "That the force behind the man in the trees is not his. It's older than him. He found it. He's learned to use pieces of it. But what he's serving, what's actually moving, has been building in the Eastern Territories since before any of the living alphas in that basin were born." The distant howls moved through the cold air outside the tent, layer upon layer of them, coming from the east. "How many packs?" Caddy asked. "Unknown." Keeper Eldana looked at the tent wall, beyond it, toward the eastern dark. "That's the question that comes next." Caddy sat with it. With the weight of everything the night had held, the basin, the light, the shadow beasts, the man at the tree line and his parting words, and the white wolf and its silver eyes, and the unambiguous direction of its gaze. With the 9 records and the unwritten 10th. With the tremor in the ground that had felt like something communicating. With the warm, steady presence of a man who had said always and meant it without qualification. "The Accord Alphas," she said. They felt the tremor. "Some will wake tonight. Most will wake tomorrow with questions." Keeper Eldana looked back at her. "They will look to the Silver Warden for answers." "I don't have answers yet." "No," the old woman agreed. "But you know what comes next." A pause. "You know what you need, and for the first time, you know where you are." She tilted her head slightly. "Are you still running?" Caddy thought about the blank page in the ancient book, about her own handprints in the silver-lit snow outside her tent, plus about the future she'd decided, up on the slope in the moonlight with Evander's hand warm over hers, that she was willing to walk toward. "No," she said. Keeper Eldana nodded once, slowly, with the quality of someone marking something in an internal record that had been waiting for this entry. "Then the story," the old woman said, "is just beginning." Outside the tent, the eastern howls continued. Somewhere in the dark forest beyond the basin's rim, the white wolf moved through the trees with the unhurried certainty of something that had been walking a very long time and knew exactly where it was going. In the medical tent, Emmerich opened his eyes fully for the first time since the attack. He looked at the tent ceiling. He listened to the distant howls with the expression of someone parsing information and assembling a picture from pieces he didn't yet have all of. Then he reached for the pack communication device beside his cot with the deliberate efficiency of a 24-year-old who had missed everything and was already calculating how to catch up. In the council's temporary holding structure, Aldrich sat in the dark with his hands folded on the table in front of him, and his eyes very still, and his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who had not yet decided whether the plan had failed or simply shifted to its next phase. In her tent, Caddy picked up the ancient book again. She turned to the blank 9th record, looked at the empty pages that had been waiting for her, felt the silver light warm and steady in her hands. She reached for the small pen she carried in her jacket pocket, a habit from years of moving through territories, of noting landmarks and boundaries and things she needed to remember. She pressed the tip to the first empty page, and she began to write. Somewhere in the eastern dark, in a valley that didn't appear on any Accord map, in a structure built of black stone and older intention, a figure sat before a fire that burned without fuel and without warmth. The man from the tree line returned from the basin, composed, recalibrating. Across from him, in the shadows beyond the firelight, something breathed, slowly, deliberately, with the rhythm of something that had been breathing for a very long time and had learned not to hurry. She held it, the man said. The breathing continued. She's stronger than the projections indicated. A sound from the shadows, low, without specific frequency. The sound of something enormous shifting its weight. Should we move the timeline? The man asked. Silence. Then, from the dark, in a voice that arrived not in the ears but behind them, not in the air but in the ground beneath the stone floor. A single word. No. A pause. She is not the only one. The fire burned. The man looked at it steadily. The others, he said. They're ready? The breathing deepened. They have been ready, the voice said, since before she was born. Outside the black stone structure, in the valley that didn't appear on any map, yet the wolves of the Eastern Territories raised their voices to the sky in the many-layered howl that had carried 40 miles on the mountain wind and reached the sleeping Accord Basin and the silver-lit hands of a woman sitting cross-legged on a bedroll with an ancient pen and a blank page. They howled, and the night swallowed the sound, and the true Alpha had not yet risen.